Hello Magic players and collectors, welcome back to the Land Library. I'm your librarian, and in this episode of Legendary Locations, I'm going over Itlimoc Cradle of the Sun, and of course the region it's in too. But just like the last couple videos where the land card is far more recognizable than the region, this one is even more so because the region doesn't really have a name. It's just kind of the mountains of Ixalan the continent on Ixalan the plain. It doesn't quite have a nice ring to it, so we're calling it the Itlimoc episode, even though it's about the mountains of Ixalan. This is actually a region with multiple legendary lands. There's two. There's, of course, the namesake of the video, Itlimoc Cradle of the Sun, and Temple of Aclazotz. Although, it's a little easier to shorten Itlimoc Cradle of the Sun to just Itlimoc, and Temple of Aclazotz kinda needs to stay Temple of Aclazotz, so it was a lot easier to just name this video Itlimoc. Both of these are transforming lands, though, that come from enchantments. Itlimoc Cradle of the Sun comes from Growing Rites of Itlimoc, which is an enchantment that has a casting cost of 2 generic and a green, and then when it enters the battlefield, you look at the top 4 cards of your library, you may reveal a creature card from them and put it into your hand. Then you put the rest, or all if you took nothing, onto the bottom of your library. It transforms at your end step if you control 4 or more creatures. And now, as a land, it can tap for a green, or tap for multiple green mana equal to the number of creatures you control. And then Temple of Aclazotz comes from the enchantment Argules? Not entirely sure how to pronounce that. Bloodfast, which costs a generic and a black, and has an ability that you pay a generic and a black and 2 life to draw a card, and transforms at the beginning of your upkeep if you are at 5 or less life. As a land, it can tap for a black or can tap and sack a creature to gain life equal to the toughness of the sacrificed creature. As for related cards, a pretty obvious one is Aclazotz himself on Aclazotz Deepest Betrayal, which also has a land on the back called Temple of the Dead, and despite being on the same card, Temple of the Dead is not really related because it's in a completely different region. In the same vein, we have Tarian's Journal, which is another side where one card is related but the other isn't, or I should say one side is related but the other isn't. The journal is very important to the lore of the temple, but the tomb on the back is in the same place that the Temple of the Dead is. So we are going to exclude both of those lands. It feels a little painful to say to ignore lands, but they're just in a different region, so they're not part of this video. But we do have a couple of other cards that do have a land on the back that are relevant, which is Primal Amulet with Primal Wellspring on the back, and Dowsing Dagger with Lost Veil on the back. And then we have some creatures. We've got Vito Fanatic of Aclazotz, Elenda the Dusk Rose, Elenda Saint of Dusk, and Acolyte of Aclazotz, which are, somewhat more related to Aclazotz himself than, like, the temple, but they're definitely still related to the temple. And now we get on to the maybes. I'm uncertain if they're truly related, but the Reapant of Itlimoc from Lost Caverns of Ixalan appears to have the Myco Tyrant in the background, so I'll include it as a maybe. And in the same way, the original print seems to have Ancient Brontodon on it, so I'll also include that as a pretty probable maybe as well. And then we have Sunpetal Grove. It's not in, like, specifically Ixalan, but the art does depict Itlimoc, so it gets a mention. Just like the Mountain and Scalding Tarn from the Shiv episode, but I'm not really gonna, like, necessarily count them. Due to the somewhat seclusion of the mountains these legendary lands reside in, there's very few related cards. So that's all I could really find. I might have missed something, but that's a total of 5 creatures, or an extra 2 with the maybes, 3 artifacts, and 2 lands that share a card with those artifacts, or a third land if you count that Sunpetal Grove, meaning there's only a total of 8 to 10 cards, depending on if you want to count different sides of a card as multiple numbers for this, or up to 13 related cards if you want to include everything as different cards and the maybes. This is a pretty meager amount for a region with 2 legendary lands, but it is what it is. Before we get into the region itself, I think I should give a little background on the plane. Ixalan is based around Mesoamerican lore and is what is known as an adventure plane. Adventure planes are typically a bit more primal and being focused more on hidden treasures, uncharted lands, and forgotten ruins, adventuring. And Ixalan certainly embodies that, being covered in untamed jungles full of beasts and dinosaurs. And another big part, although this isn't really related to being an adventure plane, is that Ixalan is hollow. It's just a big hollow sphere. And actually, the core, the inside, is where most everything began. So maybe the surface isn't really the main part of Ixalan, even though it's the original part from the original sets. But I digress. Getting into the history, there's not really any records of ancient Ixalan. It's split into 7 different ages, and only the 2 most recent ages even have names. So the origin of a lot of, why is it hollow and stuff is completely unknown. But what is known is that all records in universe of everything before the 5th age were lost to time, and out of universe, there's a little bit we know about the 4th age, but even as observers from outside, we have nothing on the first 3 ages, other than just they happened, I guess. So we're finally getting to the timeline, starting in the 4th age, because Aglazots, during the 4th age, killed every other sentient being on the plane, and drinking their blood to steal their life force, basically, and in the process achieved an almost godlike power. That's basically all we know about the 4th age. It's possible that the in-universe reason for this is because, Akazat's killed everyone, can't really keep records if everyone's dead. But then the 5th age is started when the deep gods were born in the core. Although, before the final god could emerge, Akazat's killed him, drank his blood, and took his divine power, and then also took his place, achieving actual godhood at this point, and understandably is pretty hated by the other gods and also the mortals who came later. There's a lot more to the early god dynamics that I will go over in a different video eventually. I'll make an episode on the core, but for this video you basically just need to know about Aklizatz's origin and how disliked he is. As you can imagine, as a hated god, he kinda started a war. It was called the Whispering War, and it ended with Aglazatz's defeat and imprisonment in the Temple of the Dead. Sealed away in his tomb, Aglazatz fell into a deep slumber, and his power waned a lot, which led to the next age, the Age of the Sun. After millennia of peace and prosperity, interplanar invaders called the Fomori attacked, leading to another war that lasted 320 years. And after the Fomori were defeated and expelled, it led to the people in the core realizing there's a bit more to the world, and they started to explore more, discovering and then immigrating to the surface. Over the next few centuries, the 3 main races of the time populated the surface, but as more and more people were there, it created a struggle for territory. The merfolk were kind of able to just retreat to the waters, but the humans and Malamet, who were coming up from the core, were competing for each other's land a lot, and eventually the Malamet were overwhelmed by the humans' Sun Empire and went back down into the caverns. And with all that background out of the way, we're gonna actually back up just a little bit to before the Sun Empire was actually formed. Deep within the northern mountains, there was a valley that had once been the site of a great cataclysm, thought to be almost like a scar slowly draining away the life of the surface. But in its center stood a lone tree that had survived it all. The merfolk asked the new humans on the surface to help them, and together the merfolk and human priests were able to invoke a powerful blessing of fertility, turning the area into a great jungle and restoring the life force of the surface and renewing the flow of the primal wellspring. I'm not entirely sure that those 2 things are related, but the primal wellspring is like a magically generating eternal source of water, so I think that the extra magic did kind of renew it, but I can't really say that for certain. Additionally, in these early times, at the beginning of the immigration, the followers of Aklazatz that had survived built a secret temple in the southern mountains. Unlike the other gods who had many temples, this was the only temple of Aclazotz and was kept hidden so that it wouldn't be found out and destroyed. And soon thereafter, deep in the caverns, possibly due to the renewed life force from Itlimoc, but can't say for certain, the micro-tyrant was born and started making myconoids. These little fungus creatures that obey him as a hive mind, and after many years they started overwhelming the core. In an attempt to prevent them from disturbing the surface, all paths in and out of the core were sealed. This is also after the Sun Empire was created and the Malamute retreated back into the caverns. And since this is also after the Sun Empire had been established and had been trading with the people of the core, trade got kind of cut off. And over the centuries, the people of the surface completely forgot about the core at all. But that wasn't the only thing forgotten, because the Temple of Aclazotz also had an entrance, and once that was sealed off, it was eventually forgotten about too. Which leads to the next and current age, the Quiet Age. This is also the first age with a specific starting date. It started in 3279 AR with the construction of a powerful artifact called the Immortal Sun. This, however, was on the other main continent of Ixalan's surface called Torazon. Torazon will probably eventually get an episode, so I don't know that I'll go into too much detail here, but basically, the Immortal Sun stayed there for centuries until it was stolen in 3760, causing a civil war on Torazon. The stolen Immortal Sun was taken to Ixalan, the continent, and Alenda, a warrior nun who had been guarding it, led a group to Ixalan to reclaim it. Although there were probably several members, we only really have the names of two, which is Alenda and Tarian. These two searched on Ixalan for several years, and although they did not find the Immortal Sun, they did find the Temple of Aclazotz and its sealed entrance to the core. Figuring out how to open it, exploring further, they made it all the way to Aclazotz's tomb, and stirring him slightly, they learned of his dark rituals and turned into the first vampires. Or I should say, just one vampire? Tarian's journey seems to mysteriously end here, and although I can't confirm it, I highly suspect that Tarian either was killed or willingly sacrificed himself in the ritual to turn Alenda into the first vampire. Returning to the surface with Tarian's well-kept journal, Alenda continued searching, but after a few hundred years searching alone without finding it, Alenda went back to Torazon to hopefully get some backup. The civil war there, which, by the way, was still going, for the entire 3 centuries Alenda was gone, was soon brought to an end when Alenda started kind of turning people into vampires. But just because she gave them the power of vampirism doesn't mean they actually wanted to help her. So she was unable to actually secure backup and just went back to Ixalan to search alone. She did eventually find the Immortal Sun, but unable to claim it alone, she went back to the Tomb of Aclazotz to seal herself away. She was hoping to eventually be reawakened by the vampires she had created, coming to help her reclaim the Immortal Sun. But back on Torazon, the newly formed Dusk Legion of vampires overpowered the rest of the continent, conquering city after city for the next several hundred years, eventually taking over the entire continent. With absolute control of the continent, they did eventually turn their sights on Ixalan and attempted an invasion, a full-fledged invasion, but were unsuccessful. Alenda was eventually reawakened and was shocked to see what the vampires had become. She went back to Torazon to try teaching more humility and restraint, but before long, the new Phyrexians invaded in 4562 AR, and she returned to Ixalan to repel the Phyrexians. The destruction caused by the invasion did do things, though. It reopened the sealed caverns, and it woke up Aclazotz. Aclazotz started whispering to Vito, his most loyal follower, to come free him, and armed with Tarian's journal, Vito was able to get to the temple, which at this point was kind of overgrown and even more hidden than before, and was able to use blood sacrifices to reopen the entrance, go down into the core, and find the hidden Aclazotz's tomb as well, and freed him. In the ensuing fight with the people of the core to get back out, Vito did die, But Aclazotz didn't, and he made it out to the surface and was last seen heading towards Torazon. This is like the end point of the known timeline, and I definitely covered a few things from outside of the mountains, but this seemed pretty necessary to understand about the events that actually did happen in the mountains. I guess I should also say, I forgot to mention it in the actual Itlimoc part, but after Itlimoc was revived, it was turned into a, sacred place, and no one was allowed to enter anymore, which is why we don't really have anything for Itlimoc after it being revived. Both of these legendary lands were first printed in the Ixalan set, but only one of them has been reprinted in the most recent Lost Caverns of Ixalan set. And that kind of gives you a hint of how impactful they are. Itlimoc is the one that got reprinted because it's definitely the better of the two. Itlimoc is an extremely good land, making mana equal to your number of creatures. It would get tons of mana value in a deck that floods the board with creatures like elves or insects, but it does have a big problem. It has to sit as an enchantment for a while, which is more commonly targetable, can be countered, and is just blatantly obvious what you're doing. You're just choreographing exactly what you're gonna do, so everyone who sees your extremely powerful land incoming is gonna have it be like a top priority to get rid of, and is pretty likely to be destroyed before you even get to transform it. You could try to play it when you already have 4 creatures to transform it on the same turn you play it, which will have it avoid sitting as a target, but this still won't protect you from counterspells. So this is absolutely a top tier land once it actually is a land, but the hard part is getting the land out at all. Temple of Aclazotz, on the other hand, is a little confused about what it even wants to do. As a land, its abilities are kinda underwhelming. Tap for a black or sack for a creature to gain life. There's definitely a niche for decks that want to sacrifice creatures and or gain life, but this doesn't really go that well in them because of how it transforms. It transforms by starting your turn at 5 or less life. It can be extremely difficult to keep your life total in a specific range, especially when it's not even your own turn. And when the range is 1 to 5, and a life gain or life steal deck is probably going to keep your life total way higher because of, the life gain and life steal, so it's going to be pretty hard to transform it. And even when it does transform, you'll barely actually get the life back, since it taps so you can only do 1 per turn, and it has to sacrifice a creature. So if you have something that's really safe to sacrifice, like a Silver Smoke Ghoul, it's not really gonna get a whole lot of value. Nobody's gonna sack something big like a Maha just for 5 life. The enchantment side is generally much more useful. 2 mana and 2 life to draw is decent in black, especially, because a deck that wants you to drop your life, like a Death Shadow deck, but you'll probably just not transform it, because the potential card draw and life drop is much more valuable than the life gain or black mana. So, in the right situation, it's a decent land, but that situation is pretty specific and rare, pretty much to the point where you'll be building a deck around it rather than just including it, and this card is just kind of better off as an enchantment. Itlimoc, Cradle of the Sun is an extremely good S level land, but this card isn't just a land, and it's basically too good for its own good. It's very choreographed, so everyone sees it coming, and it doesn't have the inherent protections from just being a land when played. So it's a bit difficult and inconsistent to get it out, which really nerfs its potential. On the lore side, doesn't have a lot of events, but its history certainly makes it to be a very legendary place, being the heart, basically, of the surface and placing it firmly in A tier. Temple of Aclazotz is a bit lower ranked. The non land side is much more useful than the land side, so that doesn't really bode well for it. Its difficult and risky transformation makes this pretty niche land even more niche because you're even less likely to see it, but its ability is pretty decent if you look at it in a vacuum and ignore the circumstances of actually getting it into play. So this is maybe like a high D, low C tier card, but it's getting really carried by its lore, The temple is a very important and impactful location, easily one of the most critical locations on the surface, and for that, it's going up to B tier. If you've made it this far in the video, go ahead and drop a like for turn and subscribe for more landfill content. If I missed anything, got anything wrong, or you just have questions, let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next legendary locations with Iganjo over in Kamigawa.